Welcome to the ChangeMakers podcast, produced by City Current and powered by Higginbotham. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. On this episode, we're diving into faith, nonprofit leadership, neighborhood and community revitalization. That's why we're honored to have with us Dr. Chris Lambert. He is the founder and CEO of Life Remodeled, award-winning author of Next Level Nonprofit, and founder of the Next Level Nonprofit Organizational Operating System. How are you doing?
Jeremy, bro, it's great to be with you. By the way, feel free to call me either just Lambert or Lambo, and I'm excited to dive in with you.
I like Lambo, so we'll go with that.
Okay, all right.
Let's start. The fun of ChangeMakers is we get to know your personal story and how that plays out with everything you're doing professionally. We'll talk all about how you're powering the good in so many different ways, but let's start with your childhood. Tell us about where you grew up.
I was born and raised in a small town. And when I say small town, I mean we didn't have a four-way stoplight until I was in middle school in northern Indiana. So the words urban neighborhood revitalization were three words I never heard in succession as a child.
What about brothers, sisters, family, mom and dad? What all did they do?
I have an older sister. She's 4 years older. She's wonderful. She now lives in the Houston area of Texas. And my mom and dad were school teachers. They taught for 40 years in public education.
So for you, faith plays an important role, which we'll weave in throughout. But was that a big piece of you growing up?
So my parents would take us to church service maybe once a month because they felt like it was the right thing to do. But I can't ever remember them talking about God in the home. For whatever reason, I was this really passionate spiritual kid about the person of Jesus in particular. And I do want to say that although we'll unpack some of my journey, the organizations I lead now, Life Remodeled and Next Level Nonprofit, are very intentionally not religious organizations, but my faith continues to be the center and the driving force of anything good that I do. Anything that I do that's not so good, I don't want to give Jesus the credit for that.
Well, we talk about City Current. I mean, I do personally in terms of being a corporate ministry, in terms of doing all that we do to help nonprofits lift the community. So I think it ties in when you talk about the work you do missionally, personally, and how that plays out obviously corporately to be able to make a difference. So all of that, that's why this personal journey is so important to unpack. So carry that in, because I know for you, you were looking at going and being a lawyer. And so you had very different career aspirations. Talk about the pivots through school. So walk us through school and college and where the pivots start to happen.
So I'll go back to the Jesus passionate kid that I was growing up. In 8th grade, other kids at school called me Lambert, the Jesus freak. And I tried to convert everybody to Christianity. I wasn't very effective. And my high school was actually about the size of the town that I grew up in, because different cities all went to this same high school. And I eventually hit a growth spurt right before I turned 16 and became kind of a big fish in a small pond with athletics, got some school records, whatnot. And I started looking around at my buddies who were not following God. And I came to the conclusion that they were having a lot more fun in life than me and Jesus. So I said, goodbye, Jesus. Really, to be completely accurate, I kind of gave him the middle finger. And for the next 6 years of my life, I basically did whatever I wanted to do, whatever I thought was going to make me the most happy. And I went to Indiana University. I studied business. My plan was to go to law school, as you said, and become a real estate developer, because my motivation was to make as much money as I could to fund the lifestyle I thought I wanted. And I figured that was a great way to do it. At IU, I joined what was then the largest fraternity on the campus so I could have more of all the things that I was looking for at this time of my life. But my junior year of college, I decided to move to Australia for 6 months to study, and I'm putting that in air quotes, overseas. And while I was in Australia, I experienced what I would call a radical encounter with God that changed the entire trajectory of my life. And it was a series of events that culminated in, I met a couple of guys who became my best friends there. They happened to be Jesus followers. They were pretty fun guys, though, that could go out to a bar and have a few drinks and go home. And meanwhile, I'd stay out doing the things they weren't doing. They kept trying to get me to come to church service. And I was like, dude, that ain't going to happen. I was doing some traveling in Southeast Asia, the Pacific Rim, Australia. And I began to realize the world was a very big place. It did not revolve around me and my 22-year-old ego. So all of these different factors played into eventually I'm in a church service with these guys, and this guy tells a story that in many ways outlines my life to a T, or at least key components. I ended up hearing God speak to me for the first time in my life, and it was not an audible voice, but it was more clear than anything that I'd ever heard another human being saying. I had this, I make a decision at this point. I got down on my knees. I looked up, I said, God, from this moment forward, I'm going to stop doing whatever you want me to stop doing. I'm going to start doing whatever you want me to start doing by faith in you, Jesus. Amen. And the biggest transformation that happened very quickly in my mind and heart and my soul was prior to this experience. You know, I loved my family, my friends, my fraternity brothers, but I had no interest in the world outside my little bubble. Immediately, I had this very strong sense of curiosity with people that I would meet. I'd want to know who they were, what they were going through, if they were going through anything I could help with. And I come back to Indiana University for my senior year. Before I left IU, there was not a single Jesus follower or Christian in this entire fraternity of 180 guys. Before I got back, this had nothing to do with me. My three best friends in the fraternity actually also had these crazy encounters with God, plus my drug dealer, who was an atheist before I left. I come back, they see I'm now this Jesus follower, they're Jesus followers. We get this Bible study going in the fraternity. We start leading tons of guys to faith. It was crazy. I started thinking about my future. I realized, I don't want to go to law school and become a real estate developer, because now I no longer care about money as the center of my passion. I just want to help people connect with God. I felt like he was calling me to be a pastor. So I moved to LA, studied at a seminary, met the woman who became my wife. We felt led to come to Detroit and start a church. And then we did what most people do. We moved to Africa for 9 months. I lived in a mud hut in a Muslim village with no running water in Liberia, became a community developer, knew nothing about that, learned it on the fly. That experience radically reshaped my view of why I'm here on earth, and really my view of Jesus's ministry in particular. And I realized that he spent the majority of his ministry with people who were the most marginalized and oppressed. And he was calling us to spend a whole lot of our time, talents, and resources doing the same. So when we started this church in Detroit in 2007, it was to try to reach people who were experiencing a lot of those life challenges that kind of align with suffering and what I just described. And that was 2007. And then in 2010, I got another vision to start a nonprofit called Life Remodeled. And so I'll stop there and say, where do you want to go next?
Well, and I think Life Remodel is a great place to carry it forward, because when you look at the revitalization and the passion going back originally to developing real estate, right? Like in a way, when you look back and you think all of these passions over here and experiences, how in the world are they ever going to line up? And then you start looking back and it's like, oh, wait a second, all of these things actually carry forward to what I'm doing today. The path is very windy, but it still plays out to what I'm doing today. So go ahead and carry that into how you got into that, because you now are taking very large buildings, school buildings, and you're revitalizing them and making them activations for neighborhoods and for communities.
It's funny how you put those dots together so quickly. So I started Life Remodeled in 2010. It wasn't until 2014 when someone looked me in the eye and said, dude, do you know that you're a real estate developer? And that is what you thought you were going to be before you had this, you know, your heart really calibrated correctly. And I didn't even realize that connection until this guy said that. So Life Remodeled is in Detroit. Let me tell you why we exist, what we do, how we do it. The reason we exist is because we're absolutely convinced Detroit residents and students have all the talent they need, but many don't have access to all the opportunities they need to thrive. And so what we do in response to this reality is we repurpose large vacant school buildings into one-stop hubs of opportunity for entire families to thrive. We fill these buildings with the best and brightest nonprofits who are providing the services directly requested by community members, which happen to be three areas, right? That would be after-school youth programs, workforce development initiatives that lead to sustainable, livable wage jobs, and health and human services that are providing access to much-needed healthcare. And then we help these organizations collaborate to move the needle in ways that none of us could have ever achieved alone. So that's the work of Life Remodeled.
Carry that into lessons for other cities, because what you're talking about is a lot of important pieces that I think others need to know, right? So one is, for most communities, transportation is a barrier, access is a barrier. Many of these providers and nonprofits work in silos, so you've got to go to a lot of different places to get the things you need to ultimately move forward. And life is complex, right? So for youth, for families, for adults, like, you're not facing one challenge, you're facing a domino of many challenges that, compound. So being able to go someplace within a neighborhood that allows easy access, so no barrier to transportation, one place where they can get access to everything, and those nonprofits can also collaborate with each other and find more innovations to serve. I think that in and of itself is a really cool thing that you're doing that others can replicate in other cities, because so many, especially large cities, are facing this very real challenge of how do we help our own citizens in a meaningful way, a significant way. So share some of the things, like the lessons that you're learning that have been kind of aha moments throughout this process.
Yeah, I think most of our listeners are familiar with the challenges that the city of Detroit has faced over the years, because it was plastered everywhere. And in 2010, Time magazine called Detroit the icon for the failed American city. And then in 2019, we were called the comeback city. But the reality is that comeback in many only ways is limited to only what we would now call downtown and midtown Detroit, which are 7.2 square miles of a city that is actually 139 square miles citywide. And, the auto companies in the city that literally put the world on wheels back in the day did what they could to make sure that public transportation wasn't a thing in Detroit. So we have probably the worst public transit for a city of our size. Actually, I know we do, based on the data. And you're absolutely right. Proximity is everything. And so let's talk about school buildings for a minute. Schools that were built in the late 1800s, early 1900s in the Midwest and really all across America, typically they were built in the heart of residential communities. They were walkable. They were beacons of hope for academics, athletics, and social advancement. When a school building closes in a neighborhood that's experienced high levels of disinvestment, and by the way, that school closing doesn't happen overnight. That's the result of decades of disinvestment. In many ways, that closure is a dagger to the heart of hope for the community. And so what we do is we take this painful disinvestment and we repurpose it into a beacon of hope and opportunity that actually serves the entire family. And so some of the greatest lessons that we've learned is I'm not a believer in doing community development to a community or for a community. I believe the real power is when we do it with a community. And so that means the most important work is discovering what are the hopes, dreams, visions, and values of the residents, of the students who have experienced this disenfranchisement, this marginalization, this oppression for so many years. And they have real ambitions. They know what their community needs and wants. So learning from them, what are those things? And then discovering, do they want this repurposing of this building? And if so, what do they want it to look like? Once you discover that and there's alignment, then we begin to create it, right? And creating it in the way that we do it, I just want to be very clear. There are literally hundreds of ways to repurpose buildings. And there have been studies on them around the country. The average size of what we're doing with what might be called a nonprofit hub is 30 to 35,000 square feet. Most of them are in well-to-do parts of town. Most of them focus on like back office administrative sharing of services like HR, bookkeeping, marketing. I think all of those are good things. That is not what we do. What we do is we only focus on very large buildings that are at least 90,000 square feet or more, that are in parts of town that have experienced high levels of disinvestment. They're not gentrified parts of town. And we only bring in nonprofits that are doing direct services. We say no to every nonprofit that just wants a really cool, sexy space. By the way, our spaces are absolutely gorgeous. If they just want a cool place to do administrative work, we say, bro or sister, whatever, go to WeWork, because that's where it's at. This is not that. This is about direct services. And our model has now moved the needle in such measurable ways that we are now scaling it from one on the west side of Detroit. We just bought another one on the east side of Detroit. And so we're in the process of this new project.
Yeah, and I think I want to unpack a little bit for listeners and viewers. One is the sense of ownership, like you said, with community. I think that's an important thing, because when you walk in, you say, here's what we're going to do for you. Like, nobody wants that. They want to be involved and included. And I think too, nonprofit, social enterprises, social impact organizations, like whatever phrase you want to use, the simple reality is, for those you're serving, they don't think of themselves as underserved, poor, poverty-stricken. Like, especially as a kid, like, you don't put labels on yourself. And so you want to feel like you're a part of the conversation that's building for a bright future and bringing the pride. And I love the fact, like you said, is, when you look at years, decades of, disinvestment, that's what you're, the picture you're painting in terms of what you're walking into, but then the hope it provides. The other thing is, I think from a civic pride standpoint, and we see this in Memphis and Nashville and other cities, is when you talk about rebuilding civic pride, you are stepping into a small area relatively, right? And then all of a sudden you start seeing it grow and things start to change in a bigger way. And then all of a sudden all these other pockets start to change, and then they combine and it becomes a much bigger thing where people see change is happening. Like, it's not just in a small way, it's in a big way. How are you seeing the civic pride change? How are you seeing the neighborhood pride change? How are you seeing the outlook change as a result of you stepping in with the community to create this inspirational opportunity?
Jeremy, you dropped a lot of knowledge there, and probably all your listeners are tracking with you. But for those who may be trying to put the pieces together, what you just said, I want us all to think about maybe the wealthiest suburb in our surrounding community. And what would that look like if a gigantic piece of land, publicly owned, became available, and somebody came in from the outside who doesn't live in that suburb and started making major decisions, telling this suburb what they think they need? Like, we all know how well that would go over, right? And the terminology that we use to describe communities that are resilient is incredibly important, that we take an asset-based framework, because we actually, though I didn't grow up in the neighborhoods that we invest in, I have more to learn from the communities that I get to work with, rather than the other way around. We learn from each other. Iron sharpens iron. It's so beautiful when we take that posture. So thank you for your perspective that you shared. So Gallup Research came into Detroit last year, and they performed this really important survey around what they call measuring Black thriving, and Black Americans and Black Detroiters in particular. Detroit is the largest predominantly Black city in America. And they were measuring Detroiters' perspective of basically how would they call it? Their perspective on their ability to thrive based on the specific neighborhood they lived in. So they surveyed Detroiters all across the city, and they were measuring things like, do you have access to high quality healthcare, high quality education, high quality workforce development opportunities that lead to real jobs? How strong is your community collaboration, your police community relations? And do you believe you can experience economic mobility here? And interestingly, what their research showed is the neighborhood around our first opportunity hub scored number 2 in the entire city. And what's really wild about that is, when we first opened our doors in 2017 to this first opportunity hub, 80% of people who lived within 4.5 square miles lived at or below the poverty line. And you pointed out that pride, that perception, that belief that you can experience thriving is everything. And there aren't any other major development projects that have led to that shift in mindset. Another stat that we just learned, was we now have the lowest crime in the entire city of Detroit in this neighborhood. And to put that in perspective, before we opened our doors, this neighborhood was in the top 10 highest crime rates in the city. And so the model is working because it is with, and community members are leading the way. There's a community advisory council that consistently advises us on what do community members want here, because we have to recognize doing community engagement on the front end of the project is not enough. Communities are always evolving, growing, new people are moving in. And it's an ongoing relationship and process, not just a box that we check on the front end to make sure we're doing something, ethically. It's about being truly redemptive in a relational way that, again, it's lifelong lessons for all of us along the way.
Well, speaking of lifelong lessons, you've got a book. And so talk about what led you to write the book. Give us a little bit of a teaser on the book.
Okay, I started Life Remodeled in 2010, and I made some epic failures as a CEO. I could go on on your show, but I'll just name a couple. So I had no idea how to recruit the best talent around. I hired people that had yellow and red flags that I didn't even know what to look for. Now, knowing what I know, I would have known not to make those hires. But if people that joined our team weren't already rock stars who could, independently overcome their own challenges, I had no idea how to help people grow and develop, let alone thrive as a team. We had a strategic plan that looked good on paper. We did not know how to operationalize it. The list could go on and on and on. In 2014, somebody hands me this book called Traction, written by a guy who now has become one of my heroes, and I love him dearly and know him personally, Gino Wickman, who created this system called EOS, which many of our listeners are going to know, some are not, but basically it's a pull-off-the-shelf organizational operating system that was created for for-profit companies. And I loved it. I wanted to do the system. I wanted to hire one of the implementers to help us along, but the cost was prohibitive. So we said, no, forget it. We're going to implement it ourselves. We did, and we grew very, very rapidly. And then eventually we were actually able to get an implementer who was remarkable. And once he came on board, we grew so much further, so much faster. However, we had to do a lot of code switching or discerning and reshaping the language, because again, it was created for for-profit companies. And because I'm someone who, when I find something good, I'm going to tell everybody about it, I literally tried to convince over 100 nonprofits to do EOS. And I've been told that I could sell ice to an Eskimo, and not a single one of them took me up on this proposition. And I realized there were two roadblocks. Number one, the business language that most nonprofit leaders weren't going to take the time to translate. And there are some real distinctions between a for-profit and a nonprofit. And the other was the cost of implementation was perceived as prohibitive. So that led me and our team to create, to what is our knowledge, the very first and only system. And by the way, there's so many great for-profit systems out there. My favorite one is actually Pinnacle. There's Scaling Up. There's Bloom Growth. There's eMyth, 4DX. The list goes on and on and on, right? But to our knowledge, we've created the first and only using the same principles that everyone is using, that is specifically for the nonprofit sector. And so I wrote this book in a way that organizations can self-implement it anywhere in the world and see very significant results. And we are also now certifying coaches around the country who are charging way less rates than what is available on the market.
When you look at what that is going to do in terms of the legacy impact, what are some of your goals with this?
Thank you for asking that. Out of everything I've ever done in life, or ever been a part of, this has the potential to be by far the most exponentially impactful in the social sector of anything I've even been a part of. Because for our listeners that understand organizational operating systems, you know what that does to scaling a business. And maybe you even know what it can do to a nonprofit when it's rightly interpreted. But for those who don't know, I can say this: when you implement these principles, you will end up serving more people and you will serve them far more effectively. And so the exponential growth of our goal is within 10 years, we want 2,500 nonprofits around the country implementing this methodology. And we can unpack any of that if you want to unpack it on this show, but that's going to translate to radical shift in our sector, which in my perspective, right, so many of my nonprofit friends are incredible human beings who are very passionate about the people they serve, but also are unfamiliar with some of these concepts that are absolutely game changing.
And what you're alluding to, we talk about this a lot, is in the nonprofit space, the social enterprise, social impact organization, that space, people are driven missionally, right? Like they want to help, they want to serve, they want to lift, they want to make a difference. But just like in the world of athletics, where you could be a great player, that doesn't make you a great coach, right? Or you could be a great coach, like a tennis coach, but that doesn't mean you know how to run a business to make it sustainable, to make it long lasting, and to be able to serve more and, do all these things, because you're just running one program on a court versus like running an actual program and facility and things like that. So my point is, when you talk about stepping in many cases, you don't know what you don't know, but to have a nonprofit that really can double down, that can scale, that can be sustainable and long lasting, that can be really impactful, because if you don't know also what's actually moving the needle, you could be spending a lot of time in things that look good on paper, but ultimately aren't making a real difference and moving someone in a new direction in their life and career. So all of this from a business sense, and just like you said, yes, there's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. But the reality is, if you don't know how to run it as a business, then you ultimately are not making the difference that you want to make. And so I think this is extremely important in terms of, like we're talking about, the legacy, but ultimately the global impact that these nonprofits can ultimately have in moving the actual needle. And so go ahead and dive in a little deeper in terms of the operating system. And I'll let you kind of start wherever you want to start, but give us a little bit of a deeper dive on why this is so important, and maybe one or two tips, tricks, things that you want to throw out there based on this.
All right. So the why, I'll start with that. Why this is so important is because people who are served by nonprofit organizations deserve the highest levels of excellence we can possibly give them. I don't know hardly any nonprofit leader that doesn't believe that. Okay. But I'll break down the system into its simplest form. It's really four key components. Number one is team unity. Number two is compelling vision. Three is right strategy. Four is disciplined execution. So let's just talk about number one. Team unity has everything to do with attracting the right talent, developing talent, retaining talent. I don't know an organization, business or nonprofit, that those aren't relevant topics to all across the country and the world. In our nonprofit sector, it is more difficult to do those things. We are not supposed to pay our people typically what for-profit companies can pay. And so we got to try to woo Mother Teresa's into our world, and there aren't enough Mother Teresa's out there. So our pipeline for talent is actually more competitive, more difficult than the for-profit sector, which makes it all the more important that we understand how to do it. Now, when we get that talent, we call them reindeer, because unicorns don't exist. But reindeer are almost mythical in their own right. When we find reindeer, we want to keep them. And there is an art and a science to keeping reindeer. And also the truth is, all of us are on a growth trajectory if we so choose. And sometimes us as nonprofit leaders, we don't really know how to help someone develop to become the highest and best professional version of themselves. And then we'll get to the pinnacle of that, which is team unity. So having a team of superstars is not enough. I mean, the 2004 Lakers proved that when the Detroit Pistons, the 2000s versions of the bad boys, who had no right in being in the same gym in the NBA finals, kicked their butts, right? And so team unity is absolutely everything. And that's why it's the foundation for the whole model. The whole model is about people. Who is greater than how? So we have some simple tools that help team members discern, do we have reindeer? And it's a really quick tool you can use as a worldview to look at your team members, first and foremost, to know how to encourage them. And then secondly, how to coach them. And thirdly, if you discover a team member is uncoachable, how to move them off the bus, right? And get the right people and then recruit the right people. Another practice that I see in the sector is these two extremes, right? Either a nonprofit doesn't have a strategic plan, and that's typically smaller or startup nonprofits, or, and this is broad strokes, they have a 10-page plus plan that's doing a remarkable job sitting on a shelf collecting dust. And we pull it out when our funders come over and say, look, we have a strategic plan, right? But nobody in the organization knows what's in that thing. And so one of the essential principles that great organizations, namely businesses, are doing all over the world is simplifying your strategic plan to 2 pages. And there is a science and an art to that. And there's a way to do it in the nonprofit sector that is different than the way they're doing it in the for-profit sector. And the reason we do this is because page 1 answers the question, where are we going? Looking 10 years out, 3 years out, 3 years out. Page 2 answers the question, how do we get there? Looking 1 year out and even 90 days out. And what that eventually does is you can share this with your entire team in a way that everyone knows where you're going and how you're going to get there, and they're excited about it. And then you begin to break down that strategic plan into 90-day quarterly priorities, where eventually every single team member, and this works with an organization of 2 people, and it works with an organization of 200 people or even 2,000 people. Eventually, all of them have 3 to 7 of the most important things they know they need to get done that quarter to align with the 10-year moonshot and the 3-year snapshot and the 1-year goals and so on and so forth. And so there's nothing magical about these principles. They don't work by just reading them. The program works if you work it. And these are principles. These are not fly-by-night fads that I came up with. No, these have been around for decades, right? And they work when you work it.
Yeah, and it goes back to being intentional with your efforts, being intentional, being strategic, working with your team, and the ownership and commitment. Like, there's all these things that apply, I think, very importantly. How the process of writing the book, finishing the book, getting the book out there, how has it changed your leadership?
Wow. All right. So writing that book was a whole lot of fun at first. And then you go through the phase where you're like, oh my gosh, this is crap. No one's going to like it. It's terrible. And then you get feedback from your buddies and others and critical feedback. And you're like, oh no, people actually like it. It's good, right? It's great. And what I've learned through this is I never wanted to write a book until I wanted to write a book, but I never wanted to write one until I knew it was going to make a meaningful impact in the world. And so the place that I've come to is I don't get excited when someone says, oh, I read the book and I loved it. I'm not looking for book sales. I get excited when a nonprofit says, we read the book, we're implementing it right now. And especially when they say, can you help us do it? Because yes, we can help them go a whole lot further, faster. And it really, one of the key components that's written about in the book is who is greater than how. And I got to tell you, it's one thing to scale Life Remodeled in Detroit, which we've done well. It's another thing to have a vision to scale something nationwide and maybe even globally one day. And the work that I've done to scale it has only reinforced that concept, who is greater than how, tenfold. Because if we were to try to figure out, wow, how do we convince more nonprofits to implement this system in Memphis and Chicago and Texas and wherever, that's one thing. But instead, we've said our strategy is let's find great coaches who can implement this system. And then we've said, well, let's find the systems that are out there and see if we can partner with them for their existing coaches to implement this system, right? And so we're unpacking all this fun adventure. And I got to tell you, I'm meeting incredible humans along the way who already have this type of vision or who already have implemented business systems. And they're like, oh my goodness, this is what we've been looking for, right? So it's an adventure, brother.
It also goes to show, though, when you have the clarity around the end goal, there's so many ways to get there, right? And so you don't have to be focused on just one path when you can be creative and find many to ultimately get to the core of what you're trying to accomplish. So obviously, people can tell really fast. You're passionate, you're articulate, storyteller, you've got all the results, what you're trying to accomplish on the goal side is massively impressive, which leads over into the speaking and sharing this story. So talk about, for you as a speaker, the things that you're focused on, passionate about, the message you're getting out there.
I want to get on stages where nonprofit leaders are present who are coming looking for opportunities to grow, to increase their impact. And so I don't do speaking as a lifestyle to fund, how I get my daily bread, my bread and butter or whatnot. For me, speaking is very much a passion. One, it's a gift, but I only want to use it where it's really going to move the needle. I also love to speak with business leaders who are passionate about nonprofit causes, because I have found that it is many board members who are business leaders who understand what I'm talking about very, very quickly. In fact, there's a board chair of an organization called Gilda's Club, which is a national nonprofit that ensures no one faces cancer alone. Beautiful organization that I have had the pleasure of coaching. And this board chair, he leads a $1 billion automotive supplier company. And he called me up, and I actually wasn't able to answer. I was in a meeting, but he left a voicemail, and I've saved that voicemail. And he now has said this publicly. We recorded it on one of our videos. And he said, basically, man, I've been working with my executive director of this nonprofit to implement these ideas for years. How did you do it? Right. And I said, well, it was simple. We just spoke her language. And he's like, oh, boom, duh. Right. And that's what we do in any group that we're trying to reach, whether it's with marketing or whether it's working in another culture with literally another language. We want to learn how people think and where they're coming from. And so I'm really passionate about nonprofit leaders and nonprofit organizations, not because I geek out on operations. I'm going to be honest. I'm a visionary who is passionate about people and truly moving the needle. Operations are a means to that goal for me. And so I would love to speak at anyone's event where that kind of audience is present.
It also goes to show it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. Like the terminology and, speaking the language, right? Like you have to know how to translate it. If you don't know how to translate it, it gets lost in translation. So for you, talk about your family going through this journey, because as you alluded to, like for you and your wife, you go on this journey together to, build wells and help a community. And so share a little bit of the family perspective on all of this work, and then we'll transition over into a fun lightning round.
Yeah, I married way out of my league. I married an incredible human being who my wife has a doctorate in psychotherapy and pastoral counseling. We met at seminary. And she decided to do the stay-at-home mom thing for the first 13 years, which was her decision. I supported whatever she wanted to do. But now she's a hospice chaplain. All right. That just, in a nutshell, tells you what an incredible human being my wife is. Our boys are about to be 15 and 12. We try to expose them as much as possible to this work. And they actually volunteer. They love doing that work. But I do want to get vulnerable for a minute, because I got to say, in my journey, one of the things that I struggle with is I learned that I am very much addicted to doing. I struggle in some ways to define myself by what God says about me, who I am as a human being. And I'm a workaholic in a lot of ways. And so actually learning about that origin story of where that began for me, where I first lost agency and how I reinvented myself in some unhealthy ways and used achievement as a way to define myself rather than truly being, has been one of the most important journeys I've ever been on. And it's helped me become a much better husband and father. And that was the impetus that gave me some of the flags where I realized that I was failing as a husband, and a father, to realize, like, where's this coming from? And I want to say that journey for the entrepreneur, or for really any of us as business leaders or nonprofit leaders, is so fruitful and profitable. It has helped me even believe even more in the things that I just said about who is greater than how. Relationships are everything. Right people, right seats, and truly developing a united team. It's not just a means to an end. It's actually the journey in and of itself, right? Everything is about people. And I can say that all day, brother, but I'm going to tell you, like, I do believe it up here, but I am still learning to unpack my junk and live it out in here.
We all are. And I'm glad you went there, because I think, especially as men, you do tend to put your worth in the achievements. And it's hard to back up and say, wait a second, just live life as a human, as a part of this community, and who you are, especially as a father, as a husband. Like, there's way more, to you than just the achievement, because otherwise you do get wrapped up in being a workaholic, and then you lose the relationships with everything.
Wow.
So, I think there's, especially for entrepreneurs as men, getting clarity around your identity is an important piece of this, to give you peace of mind, to give you hope, but also to be, fully the person that you're meant to be for your spouse, for your family, for your community, to be able to actually do more. So let's carry that into a lightning round. So short questions, short answers, just a fun chance to get to know you better. What's something you like to do to relax?
Travel. I've been to every continent in the world except for Antarctica.
What's a favorite spot then for you and your wife to go, or for you and your family to travel to? So what's a favorite vacation spot?
We like to mix it up every year. We go somewhere different. Our best vacation we ever did was actually to Paris.
That's a good one. When you have friends come and visit Detroit, where do you like to take them?
I want to take them right into the heart of the neighborhoods, because they're going to see the cool stuff downtown, and it is really amazing. But I want them to meet people and see, actually, this is where the heart of the city's at.
So if someone's going there and has, we'll say, 24 to 48 hours, so obviously you're going to take them there. What are some places that we have to go eat? We have to visit. What are a couple of go-to spots?
Well, I'm first going to take you to our first opportunity hub, the Durfee Innovation Society. Our riverfront has been named #1 in the United States of America. Our Art Institute has been ranked #1. Restaurants, Baobab Fair, East African cuisine, James Beard Award nominated restaurateur, a great friend of mine, She Wolf for Italian. The Detroit Athletic Club is an incredible spot. But yes, we can talk more.
Nice. What is a favorite or a fun date night for you and your wife?
We like to go actually grab a cigar, all right, and just talk. My wife doesn't smoke cigars, but she enjoys that environment and just hanging out with her and I at the Detroit Athletic Club.
What is a family tradition? It can be like a holiday tradition or a daily tradition, but what's a tradition for you and your family?
Over dinner, we do something called Rosebud Thorn, where we each share. Rose is what was a highlight of your day. Bud is what is something you hope for tomorrow or in the near future. Thorn is what happened today that didn't go the way you wanted it to.
That's a good one. I might have to use that with my own family. I like that. That's nice. Very strategic too, in terms of engaging the communication and the conversation. So what's a recent book you've read?
I recently read 10X is Easier Than 2X by Dan Sullivan. And that title is obviously very thought-provoking and fascinating. And it was a worthy read.
Any favorite TV shows or movies that you've watched recently?
Wow. I love TV series way more than movies because they're much more in depth. And I loved Ted Lasso. I wish that wouldn't have ended.
Yeah, I agree. That's another one that's like funny, but yet so many great life lessons. Carry that into a saying or a quote that inspires you. You don't have to get it verbatim, but what's a quote or a saying that inspires you?
Recently, I've heard the phrase, be where your feet are. And that is what I need to hear. And that's where I'm leaning into a lot. But to simplify it in that kind of fashion helps me be more conscious of it.
Give me something, and it can be specific or just in general, but that you've learned from your wife or your kids.
My wife really enjoys listening to people for who they are. And that art of listening is something that I am valuing and wanting to grow in. And so I'm working on those skills, because sometimes I get caught up in just listening to find where the action is, or to debate, or to prove a point, or whatnot. But my wife is incredible at just being and valuing people, and that brings the best out of me and others.
Give me something that you're looking forward to happening before the end of this year, before the end of 2024. What's something that you're looking forward to?
We're going on another family trip, this time to the Outer Banks in North Carolina, which I have a family member who has a place there at Nag's Head. And every time we do just intentional full week getaway together as a family, our relationship always evolves. And I'll use the same language as the book, to the next level, right? So I can't wait to see what's going to come out of that adventure.
Well, this last question, you're creating your legacy each and every day. You've done so much, and obviously you have many, many years to go, but many, many years from now, what do you hope that people say about you and your ability to make a difference here on earth?
I want people to use two words to describe me, and that is all in. And I want people to say that is a guy who truly valued trying to be Jesus with skin on, not trying to be the savior or anything like that, right? But this is a guy who did well following Jesus's footsteps, and that inspires others to want to do the same.
Absolutely. Well, Lambo, wrap up with where we can go to carry this conversation forward. So following you and your efforts, website, social media, where do we go to plug in and learn more?
If you want to check out Next Level Nonprofit, it's nlncoaching.org. The book's on Amazon. If you want to learn about Life Remodeled, it is liferemodeled.org.
There you go. Well, Dr. Chris Lambert, Lambo, thank you for all you do to make a difference, to power the good. You are a change maker. Thank you for coming on the ChangeMakers podcast.
Jeremy, I got a lot to learn from you. I'm going to keep listening in. This was fantastic.
Higginbotham Insurance and Financial Services is proud to power the ChangeMakers podcast. We're a people-first company that protects what matters most, the families, businesses, and trailblazers that keep our community going. As one of the nation's top independent insurance firms, Higginbotham is a single-source solution for business insurance, employee benefits, HR services, and personal insurance that's customized for you. We're here to serve you, the people you care about, and your community. Call 866-377-1959 or visit higginbotham.com.